I feel like I'm still writing, it's just I'm writing with images. I'm telling stories with images.
Okay, LEBOHANG KGANYE, so nice to meet you and to meet you here in Switzerland, in this beautiful place, in this festival Image Vevey. So my first question is, what was your introduction to images? Was it when you were a child, or did that come later in your life? How did you discover that world of images?
I actually studied photography purely by chance. I always say that I think it happened to me.
So by chance, what do you mean?
So when I was 18 and sort of deciding about what I'm going to study the following year, I knew it had to be writing, but I didn't know that writing you could study like African literature, for example. But I was definitely interested in literature, so I applied for journalism, and I got rejected for journalism. But a few months before that, in preparing for like an exam at school, I'd read something written, The Life and Death of photojournalist Kevin Carter. So the term photojournalism was new to me, and this is when I was 19 or 18. So I was like, okay, came home to my mom, I was like, oh, when I study photography, I'm going to major in photojournalism. And so when I got rejected for journalism, my mom found out about a school that teaches photography, but actually also that teaches photojournalism. So I ended up at the Market Photo Workshop by chance. And the intention was just to do it for 1 year and then reapply for writing or for journalism. And it never happened because I fell in love with images.
You didn't apply to
no
literature, or then you found your medium?
Yeah, I think also because of my love for literature, I've always brought that into the work. So I think, you know, my whole thing is about telling stories. I've always loved storytelling, and so the work that I do allows me to do that. And so that's why I felt like, what's the point of going to study, you know, writing? Because I feel like I'm still writing. It's just I'm writing with images. I'm telling stories with images.
That's a very interesting point, because of course here in Vevey, you are the winner of the Grand Prix, and you were able to produce a work that is really between fiction and reality. Somehow there's a kind of point about, you know, with your photograph, that these people that are shown in the photograph exist, or in a way, but you bring us in a fiction also. What was your experience of developing this mix of, you know, documenting with photography and fictionalize what these images would do?
I think one of my earliest works actually touches on, you know, the fact that I only got exposed to African literature as a teenager. So I grew up on Western literature, and so my discovery of literature really came at a point when maybe I was like 16, 17. And I fell in love with it because I could recognize myself in these stories. I could recognize my context being South Africa, and being black in that context. And, you know, because South Africa is also such a difficult place and a complex place to be living in, African literature made so much sense for me. And so with this work that I've produced, Staging Memories, it's based on a science fiction novel by a Malawian writer, and it's called Tau River. And he writes this fictional novel about South Africa. And so in reading it, I mean, I discovered it maybe 4 years ago. And when I discovered it, I just felt like it really was, I hadn't read like a science fiction novel from an African writer, and so that alone was really impressive for me. And so I then started to imagine it as an installation work, but as an installation work that still references that literary aspect by thinking around it as almost as a pop-up book.
That's a very interesting point. When we discover your work, you know, photography for many of us is something flat, two-dimensional. The way you construct your project is a sculptural, very sculptural, like you say, pop-up books. And also there's movement, there's something, and also there's all this magic of things moving slowly, the shadows, like a shadow theaters. So it brings you, as a viewer, really in a kind of other world where you are there just to be, transported by that. And it goes not only with the images, but it goes also with the slow motion. So how did you come from a photography, a two-dimensional piece, to the sculpture, moving sculpture?
So when I was a teenager, I was exposed to performance art, and so so I used to write a lot of poems, and then we'd perform them, and then also doing storytelling, and then performing on stage and in theater. So that's basically my sort of introduction to stage when I was about 16, and so when I started making my first cardboard cutouts, it happened when I was, let's say, 21. When I'd finished my studies, and I was working it was my first job, so when I'd finished my photography studies, I worked on set, on productions. So I worked on like these 2 soapies, so I was the sort of resident photographer, but I was extremely fascinated with the set design and like these worlds that were being, built by like cardboards. And that looked so real. That basically was how I started working with cardboard cutouts. So when I left working on set or on these television productions 2 years later, I then brought that into my artistic work. So I then started building these life-size cardboard cutouts, and I would perform in front of them. So, so obviously the background of theater and performance on stage was being used with me in terms of me performing in front of these sets that I started to make and these worlds that I was building.
But also in your work, what is interesting is that you don't pretend to hide, the setting. It's the mechanism and everything. You can even go behind and see how it is. So that's also another way of, usually you are looking in a theater and you go into a kind of fictional world, and you forget that you are in a theater, but here you make sure that people don't forget that they are looking at a mechanism and that is still constructed. It's a set that is completely constructed.
I mean, I think that's definitely an important part of my process. My practice is thinking around sort of memory and fantasy. It is thinking about sort of this idea of that there isn't like an ultimate truth, and that photography doesn't represent an ultimate truth, So this idea of like this constructed history, this constructed memory, or partly constructed, is really what the work, or even my display of how, the sort of choices that I make when I'm displaying the work or making it, that's what it's made from.
I have a final question, and we are here in a place where we celebrate art. So tonight you could have dinner and invite a guest, someone very special. Who would that be? That could be someone living or dead, that could be an artist, that could be a philosopher, musician, or anybody. Who would that be? Here in Vevey.
In Vevey?
For this tête-à-tête dinner.
Wow, that's such a loaded question, because it really is. It's a moment that I think so many people have contributed to. So last week in South Africa, I had a celebration dinner with my mentors and my team and people that have really shaped me, or shaped my thinking, shaped my process. And because this is such an important moment for me as an artist, I recognize that all of it would not have been possible with all the different mentors that have provided different, advices. And so I really believe that I come from a really good community of artists and people that it would be so difficult to choose one person. You know, I'd want to celebrate with so many.
With all these people. And it's very nice what you said, because also for me, it's also to pay homage to all the people who have an influence on your life, and that you don't are alone, and that you are an individual with a lot of things, that all the experiences you have from other people, and the direction that you take with many different people during your life. So that's...
I mean, I think I really believe in mentorship. Honestly, in retrospect, I definitely would not be where I am had it not been for the different mentors I've had. And that's something that I wish other young artists can have. People that really are honestly there in their lives to try and shape their careers and shape them as people.
Thank you. Thank you, LEBOHANG.